Okay, and we're off. So I'm delighted today to be joined by Stephen Day, who is the Chief Procurement Officer of Kantar, and some great topics we've got lined up to discuss today. But thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure. Nice to have the opportunity to chat to you.
Excellent stuff. So we're going to be looking broadly at the topics of the evolving world of services procurement and the strategic role of the CPO, which I know is a subject that you're very passionate about and you've got some really, really interesting views on. Before we dive into the detail and look at these topics, would you just be able to give a bit of background on you, what you do, your journey through the world of procurement?
Very happily, yeah. I mean, I'll say right from the get-go that I think my career has been very lucky. Although someone once reminded me that luck is where opportunity and preparation come together. So
yeah,
it was a good reminder that actually maybe I did get there by design rather than good fortune. But you can probably tell from my accent, I'm originally from the Midlands, and you're born and bred there. Did my first university degree there, and actually, as an aside, my eldest daughter has just started at the same university I went to, and the one that I met my wife at. So it's funny how
excellent.
Life comes around. But I started Rolls-Royce Aerospace, big traditional manufacturing business, and then very quickly graduated through a number of procurement roles over the years. And I think two pivotal things happened to me in my career. The first one was I was able to make the leap from doing procurement into supply chain, and I think everyone on this call will know that terminology over the years is blurred. You talk about supply chain, talk about procurement, but I did actually go into running operations for a mobile operator that became T-Mobile. Has now become Everything Everywhere. And simultaneously did a master's degree at Birmingham under a chap called Andrew Cox, and now the professor there is a guy called Chris Lonsdale. Super experience. Can't say that I've got the best grades in the world, but what it did do is again kind of opened up my mind to the broader content of what procurement was all about. And then very fortuitously have had some good sponsors and some good mentors, really. So I worked for a woman called Liliana Solomon, and she was at T-Mobile. She then went to Vodafone Romania. She asked me to go there, so I spent 3 years in Romania working for Vodafone, and then got affiliated with a chap called Detlef Schultz and Ninian Wilson that went on and drove the Vodafone procurement company. So went back to the UK, then went to Luxembourg, did 3 years there. And then more latterly, I've worked in Pearson, the publishing company, and just recently joined Kantar, which is a data analytics business recently acquired by Bain Capital. So now driving a more traditional kind of procurement transformation in a business that is pushing very hard on the doors of data and insights and analytics.
Excellent stuff. That's really interesting. And would you say, so obviously you talked about your journey and as you sort of assigning some good fortune,
yeah,
as you say, is the kind of very closely associated with good preparation and the right skills and the right attitude. But do you think that for most chief procurement officers or your kind of peers, when you look at that group, do you think most people started out with the intention of getting into procurement?
Well, it's a really, really topical subject, actually, because now as we're kind of building up the procurement capability in Kantar, it still seems to me as we reach out to folks and we're kind of got interviews and things like that. And for a lot of kids coming out of either college or university, procurement still does not seem to be a destination place that people want to go to. I get the impression it's something that people stumble into or kind of find their way into it more by luck rather than by design. And I think that's a great shame, because if you think about the melting pot of the procurement function, it's where so many things come together that represents what a business does. You know, many businesses have relationships with supply chains where they're buying products or services, adding value to it, and then selling it to customers. And if you think about that process, you know, are you buying well? Are you using suppliers that have the right security controls, the right diversity inclusion, the right supply chain themselves. Are you delivering it within the financial model? Is it the right quality? Is it supporting product design, product innovation? Are you able to execute and get it into the customers in a timely way? I mean, it's such a rich area that you can explore your category. I think, Johnny, to be perfectly honest with you, I still don't think it has the prominence that I think it really should. And I wonder why, because the CIPS has stepped up over the years. Everybody, I think, has understood through COVID how critical supply chains are. And I'm left wondering whether we as a profession just aren't talking about it loud enough.
Yeah, maybe that's the case. I mean, maybe procurement needs a kind of a rebrand in some way. But I think, the way you're discussing that there, it's entirely strategic. And it has an impact on and a relevance to so many different areas of the business that you need people with a fairly adaptable kind of skill set. Clearly, there are some core competencies to that, but it's what you're talking about is the strategic value rather than maybe what some people at face value would make more look at just like the transactional.
Well, it's a super question. I mean, I'm very fortunate in Kantar because undoubtedly Bain Capital, the guys that own our business, absolutely understand the relationship between a well managed procurement function and its ability to drive value. But I think you touch on a delicate point. I suppose it's one that we should confront early on. Is the procurement profession doing a good enough job of doing the elevator pitch with the CEO and the board, or is it in some cases reverting back to type and talking about, as you say, the very transactional nature of procurement? And let's face it, if busy CEOs have got 1,000 things on their agenda, listening to whether you have procure to pay compliance is not exactly the thing that's going to get their interest. However, I firmly believe that if you pivot it to something that resonates with what the strategic objectives of the business are, your ability to get in there and influence it is going to be a lot stronger. And you can, go back to the previous conversation. Why doesn't procurement have its prominence vis-a-vis sales, marketing, or finance? One can only conclude that those professionals are better at doing those elevator pitches and really selling the value proposition to the boards than procurement has been able to do thus far. And quite honestly, that's on all of us, either aspiring CPOs or CPOs, to continue to promote the values and what our function can deliver.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you look at it as, you get more and more digital transformation. So more and more of the stuff that should be automated can be automated.
Yeah.
And that elevates, to a certain extent, technology can enable that elevation from a transactional approach to a strategic approach. Because when you look at it, systems that are capturing these processes and capturing this data, procurement then own that data. And that's incredibly powerful. And more, businesses are appreciating the value of data, and it's what's driving businesses forward. So the opportunities are definitely there for that to be recognized more. And when you're armed with that data, I was thinking about this when I was looking at one of your articles on the strategic role of the chief procurement officer.
Yeah.
You're armed with all this data, and actually, so much about the business.
Yeah, exactly.
You're really getting a behind the scenes look at everything, but you've also got that kind of inside and outside view because you're dealing with all of the suppliers as well.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, you can tell by my grey hair, I've seen a few decades now of procurement stuff, and I've come from a world where, I'm not embarrassed to say that you had to book out time on a computer in the office, to a time where the ubiquity of accessing computer power is unbelievable. I think what's also happened is that the tools and the data that CPOs have now to tell a story about their procurement function and what it's doing is so powerful. I mean, just to give you one example, as we think about diversity and inclusion, for the first time in Kantar, we're able now to have a point of view of the 40,000 suppliers that we do our business with in North America. How many of those are owned by minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned businesses? Incredibly topical issue, right? Well, for the first time, we can now tell, and by the way, it's a very small percentage, so we've got a lot of work to do there. But that for me is the kind of pivot that procurement supply chain functions should be making with the data that they have in hand, because now you've got a conversation with the CEO that says, as you think about driving diversity and inclusion, it's just not about what you're doing with your workforce, but it's also what you're doing in your supply chain. Suddenly, you're bringing something more to the CEO as he begins to start, sorry, I beg your pardon, as they begin to start thinking about how they're going to wrestle with those topics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the recognition of the importance of diversity and inclusion and a company's overall ethics and values as it applies to the supply chain, I think that's fascinating and very encouraging, actually, because, you know, when you get people coming out of university, young people approaching the workplace today, you know, the value, the brand values and what a company is all about and their ethics is extremely important to people. It's one of the most important things to people coming into the workplace. They want to align with that.
Yeah.
And you know, that extending that to the supply chain absolutely makes sense. And actually, I think it goes both ways as well, because there are going to be certain suppliers where, you know, they may be a very valuable supplier, and actually they need to know that your ethics match up with theirs as well.
Oh, I think so. I mean, again, I think one of the things that we're going to see through the experience that we've been with COVID, I mean, undoubtedly, it's exposed the fact that extended supply chains, whilst they've been great from a pricing perspective, in terms of securing supply, it's been actually quite ruinous for some industries. I mean, look at the disaster that we've had in the Suez Canal recently. And now, if you look at the consequence of that in terms of the availability of supply, it's going to be really problematic. Look at the chip shortages that a lot of the electronic manufacturers are having, and they can't access capacity. It tells me that what's going to happen is that we're going to see more onshoring and nearshoring rather than extended supply chains. And quite honestly, there is a shortage of capacity with the nearshore supply chain. So, you know, what's going to happen is that suppliers, for the first time in a generation, are going to start choosing the customers they want to do business with rather than vice versa. And, you know, if those suppliers are smart, they're going to be wanting to work with customers that like everything in a Apple connected world, everything goes off simultaneously. You know, I think suppliers are going to want to choose companies that represent their values, where they're going to learn, where there's going to be innovation and growth for them beyond just making good margins. So I think suddenly the whole thing changes quite fundamentally. And I think what you stand for as a company, what your ethos is, has to be greater than just historically might have been a very buyer-seller transactional relationship. And I think D&I is one of those topics where I'm seeing a lot of acceleration, and thank God for it, because my fear in the past couple of years was that it would be nothing more than a passing phase and nothing would really change. But what I'm seeing now is a lot of energy in terms of really institutionalizing a mechanic and approach that is looking to really encourage diversity and inclusion in the supply chain, and Kantar is no different in that.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating when you actually break that down into a bit more detail. And again, something else that you've commented on in the past is around cognitive diversity.
Yeah,
different ways of thinking. You know, diversity is it's broad.
It sure
but
is.
It's about having different approaches in all areas, and I think that I totally agree with that in terms of you need different types of people with different backgrounds and different approaches to give you the broader view. You know, if you're trying to achieve an objective and you've clearly set out your objective as a business or as a group or as a society, you need the input of all different types of people to really get the best possible progress and outcomes. And I think, you know, that absolutely applies to supply chains as well, in the sense that, you know, with what you were talking about in terms of potentially like more onshoring and nearshoring and stuff like that, that is inevitably going to open up the opportunity for smaller suppliers as well, and more innovation and more diversity in your supply chain. And I think that's something, particularly when it comes to services procurement, is very important indeed, because ultimately services procurement is an extension of your company's workforce, whereas obviously your entire supply chain is an extension of your company as well. So yeah, just the ability to see the detail on that, and to be able to make the most effective use of that is crucial. And again, that sits with procurement, and is really a very powerful indicator of the strategic role that procurement do have.
I agree completely. Yeah.
Okay, so just touching on services procurement in a bit more detail. In terms of your career, how much of your interactions would you say have been on the services side versus kind of like the goods and materials supply chain?
That's a great question. I mean, I spent almost 15 years in telecoms, and you'd think that that's a lot of heavy lifting, physical infrastructure, which indeed it is. But even telecoms businesses have increasingly pivoted their supply chains more to services, and software, and things like that. So I've seen a big transition away from just a fully focused hardware and physical supply chain into one that has a much bigger mix of services. So just to give you some examples, it wasn't so long ago that telco businesses would build their own networks. So you needed the engineering organization, but you then needed vans, you needed all of the ancillary equipment, and then you needed to buy the network kit that went with it. Well, most telco businesses these days, whilst they may still buy if you talk about the mobile operators, the radio access network equipment, for example, they're not deploying it. They're buying a suite of services that deploys that capacity for them. So that's just a very obvious example, but one to signal how even a business like telecoms, which you think is all hardware, is actually pivoting to a world where it's a lot more services. And again, in billing, which is always a big topic in telco, 80% of that spend these days is services, people billing, customizing billing engines and building new capabilities within the infrastructure that the telcos have bought. So, I think, and I would say, do I think that services procurement is as sophisticated as maybe physical? Well, I think there's still an awful long way to go. And it's such an interesting area as well, because, think about it, if you're buying labor related services these days, how comfortable do we feel as a procurement profession striking a bargain where we've reduced costs on a like for like basis, knowing full well that people don't necessarily get living wages, and things like that. So that's why I think this fusion of how you think about running your supply chain and simultaneously diversity inclusion becomes super important, because you can't build commercial relationships knowing that people aren't getting a living wage these days, in my view. Why? Because not only is it the wrong thing to do, but you don't build sustainable relationships with those suppliers. Oftentimes they have the highest levels of turnover, the worst levels of quality, etc. So that's where I just think the sophistication of our sourcing methodologies around services can be so important in the future.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at services procurement, I've heard it, people within the industry, within procurement, talk about it just being left behind from a technology perspective, even compared to areas like contingent workforce.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's a tricky problem to solve. It's complicated. Services are all different. The way that you can't just compare price on a like-for-like basis. But I think to your point that you were making there about cost cutting, that's a really thorny issue in services procurement, in my view, because if you're addressing cost cutting, then you absolutely have those issues that you just mentioned. And you need to understand what's going on in your supplier, but you also need to understand what you're getting for it. Because the idea of cost cutting, we spent 100 million last year, we need to reduce costs to make it 90 million this year. That takes that in no way does that take into account what the return is from the delivery of those services. You're getting some great consulting, some great outsourced service delivery, all kinds of specialist services being delivered into the business. What's that driving in the business? And I think that's, again, ties into this strategic role of procurement, where if procurement professionals can really understand their services spend and really understand which suppliers are doing a great job for them and where they're really adding value, then actually it might make sense for the business to spend more on services procurement because
yeah. I mean, I've seen good examples and poor examples. I think where the best examples work is where procurement really have a clear understanding of what the value proposition is of the services they're buying, and how they lead to kind of tangible outcomes for the business. If you can really work that, then I think, as you say, you just become more sophisticated about thinking about what you're buying, and then it's not frankly a unit rate discussion. It's actually what is the scope of the service that you're buying, and do you need to expand the scope or reduce the scope? Do you need to give the opportunity for suppliers to move into other areas of things that they may not have done historically, etc., etc.? And then, it just gives you more bandwidth to have I think, a richer conversation. The other thing I think we've got to get more comfortable with and just perfect is, how do you productize services as well? I think in truth, there's a lot of repetition in terms of what we buy. And I think one of the things that we're trying to figure out in Kantar with some of the services that we buy is, how do we productize it so we can make it more uniform, and in doing so, have a much clearer relationship between the outcome of the things that we're buying and the outcomes that it delivers. And then we talked a little bit about systems. I mean, then suddenly your systems landscape becomes a lot clearer to run and operate as well, because you're productizing services. So therefore, things like your material master data and your records and all those things become a lot clearer to navigate and manage. And as I say, it comes back to the fact that I think that services procurement needs to be on a bit of an accelerated journey, I think, in terms of how it becomes more sophisticated in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. And ultimately, it comes down to data again. Comes down to understanding the information. But I also, something that I really love about just where organizations can get on top of this data and understand what they're getting from the services that they buy, is it forces the organization to think strategically. It forces them at the top level to say, where are we going? What are we doing? What's important? And it requires appropriate communication of that to all parts of the business, so that every stakeholder within a business who's procuring services, when you're delivering to outcomes, you need to know where you're going, what the outcome needs to be. And I think COVID has really driven a shift towards outcome-based work and increased the importance and shone a light on services procurement in some ways, because working to budget isn't good enough anymore. You need to, if we're spending 200 million on services, well, can someone tell me what we got for that, please? Because at the moment, all I can see is that we spent it with these companies in these dates. I don't even know what the projects were, whether they were on time, whether they delivered value, whether they were any good. So it forces the whole organization to gear themselves towards what the outcome is. But the other thing COVID has done is it's increased the acceptance of outsourced work delivery, remote work delivery. And actually, even if you've got your own staff working remotely and working from home, it does kind of drive that output agenda a little bit more, because if somebody's working from home and they've got childcare requirements, or they're homeschooling during COVID, then actually to a certain extent it doesn't really matter how they're working, or maybe not even when they're working. It's all about, are they doing a good job? Are they getting what they need to do done? And are they doing it on time? So COVID has definitely had a big big influence on this kind of transformation within services procurement. But coming back to what you said about the kind of standardization and productization of services, clearly within complex services, there are going to be certain areas that are going to be within an organization a bit more cookie cutter. I mean, we see things where people are using, for example, requirements templates and things like that, which may have some variation around them, but ultimately using the right technology, you can standardize things like that, and procurement can guide it, but you can also standardize things like contracts. But the only way that you can move forward with this type of spend is to actually capture that process and capture the granularity, because again, it comes back to the data. I mean, when you're looking at standardizing requirements, how are you addressing that in terms of looking back at requirements that you've had before? And is it a business question that you're asking stakeholders, or is it something where you're trying to interrogate the kind of previous performance and delivery?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, our business it has so many different components to it. Our big insights business has a lot of what we call customization, together with a lot of services that deliver annuity revenues. On the customized business, which is basically individual projects that get commissioned by the big brands around the world. Some of the things that we're looking at the moment is, within the multitude of individual commissions that we initiate, is there enough commonality that at a project level it looks random and variable, but as a quantum in terms of a volume level, if you look across all of it, is there enough consistency there that we can begin to start streamlining that, and as you say, create templates and standardizations, so that with the end result, the journey between customers commissioning things and our ability to execute that within the supply chain becomes a lot quicker and a lot smoother, and delivering a simplified process will also greatly aid the quality of what it is that we provide to our clients. So we're looking at that, and it's thirsty work. You have to do a lot of data crunching to get into it, to kind of really understand what it is that's there and what the data is telling you. Now, it's greatly aided by the fact that we are investing heavily in our supply chain data, improving all of our material master management, our onboarding processes, our reporting, and all that kind of stuff. And in doing so, I'm pretty optimistic that we'll begin to start seeing a lot of patterns to what we buy that will then aid us in terms of simplifying what we do.
And how much do you think procurement can really aid the stakeholders at the point of actually this requirements kind of generation, requirements capture at the beginning of the process?
Yeah. Well, when I started my career at Rolls-Royce, I remember a training course that they put me on, and they said, and it really resonated, which was 80% of the cost of something is in its design. So by the time the draftsman, I mean, that wouldn't even be a phrase many people would understand these days, but it's basically the guy, again, must remind myself to use more clear language, when the drafts person kind of put that into a template and then handed it over to procurement, you then hand it to the engineer kind of replicates exactly what it is in that specification. And I think what's changed a lot over the course of the past 20 years is that actually good procurement now is working hand in hand with, in this case, the engineering function, to actually shape the specification from the get-go, so that you're designing cost reduction into the solution that you're trying to build, rather than handing it over to procurement and then saying try and buy it at the lowest price. Now, that good procurement and now the metaphor for that in our daily lives, kind of going forward 20, 30 years, is that that it's incumbent on CPOs like me to work with the business ahead of when they think they need to start speaking to suppliers, to really understand what it is that they are needing and what's that specification, and how can we shape that specification so the cost reduction is embedded in the thing that we take to market. The challenge a lot of procurement people, Johnny, is that this then takes us into the world of cost avoidance rather than cost reduction. And this is a daily battle for us all, because most financial organizations can readily measure the difference between the price that you bought something from today versus the price that you'll buy in the future. And very easy mechanic to calculate. The challenge is that if you're putting all of your muscle into making sure that you shape the price of something in the future with a new design, so inherently that cost reduction is there from the get-go, becomes very difficult to measure. And often we use the phrase cost avoidance. You've avoided having to pay a higher price. Problem is, it's not seen in the P&L from the get-go, so it makes it very difficult to measure and activate. So then you have to think very thoughtfully about how you change the parameters of the measurement of the procurement function against what may have historically been the case. So now do you measure the cost of your procurement against the revenue, for example, of the business, and is the gross margin changing? Pivoting those conversations are really, really tough, but it really reshapes the whole raison d'etre of why you have a procurement function in a business. And I'm pretty convinced that if you can make that pivot, you know, to the beginning of the conversation, you suddenly become a really valuable capability for the organization.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and you know, it's really that cost versus value conversation, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think when you're dealing with things like procuring goods and materials, it's a bit more binary. It's kind of, you know, you know, for example, if you look at catalog buying, for example, price is much easier to use as a top level criteria. And cost. And when you get into complex services, you know, it's a mistake for organizations to just look at two consultancies and say these guys are cheaper on a day rate for a senior associate, because they might take 3 times as long, or they might do a bad job. It's more complicated than that. And this is where, again, the information needs to be captured on who am I engaging? What are they doing? What have they said they'll do? Did they do it? Did they do a good job of it? How much did they say it was going to cost? How much did it actually cost? All these data points can really feed into that. And yeah, because it's totally strategic. And if an organization wants to really be able to answer the question of what is the most effective use of our resources, that's going to tie into the permanent headcount, it's going to tie into contingent workforce, it's going to tie into services supply chain as well. And that, you know, that strategic workforce plan is part of what you're talking about in terms of prior planning and predictive strategic work to say, what is it we need to do and how do we need to do it? And actually, how best should we shape that? So I think that's absolutely fascinating. One question that raises for me is, when you look at the design of requirements like that, when you're looking at it in advance and you're putting some strategic thought into it, and building those cost savings and efficiencies in the first place, totally agree. That's the right way to it's a pragmatic way to do business. You're doing business properly. How do you then, within that process, you're doing that in advance, what's the value and how do you see the dynamic of bringing in suppliers to help further shape those requirements? Do you see that as something further down the line, or?
It's interesting, actually, because we have a couple of examples of that going on in Kantar. And, you know, obviously, I'm sure, you know, if there are any people watching this podcast, Johnny, I'm sure this will be something that they'll be thinking to themselves, which is, if you have a supplier that comes in and helps you define the spec, to what degree have you got impartiality if you want to test it in the marketplace? How do you know the spec hasn't been over embellished? All of those things are on the downside, but on the upside is the fact that it kind of accelerates your thinking in terms of scope. It kind of accelerates your thinking in terms of plausible outcomes that can be delivered. And it gauges the supplier early in the process of what it is that you need in your business. So there's kind of pluses or minuses. I think the foundational piece when you're in those type of situations is making sure that you're comfortable with that supplier, that it still passes the value for money test. And of course, we can debate what that looks like. You know, are they lower quartile, middle quartile, or upper quartile in terms of cost? I always think you need that fundamental process in place just to assure anybody that asks, did you get value for money? But I can see a lot of value, particularly in the new services that we want to bring to market, of bringing suppliers in early and helping you deliver things quickly. And you've used some language there about shaping specifications, shaping outcomes, things like that. I'm a big fan of that. I think it's great if you combine suppliers to really clear outcomes, and you can contract in a way which means that, you know, there's clear milestone payments associated with quality, and things like that. Big fan, incredibly difficult to do, because, you know, really in my experience, it's very, very dependent on the purchaser being really honest with the supplier about data, the size of the ask, the quality of the systems, the quality of the people internally. And where I've seen it go horribly wrong is that as a purchaser, you weren't candid enough about what it was like within the business, what are the challenges you face and all those kind of things. And I think, if you're going to have a really, really good relationship with vendors, you have to be really honest with them and candid and really, be less penal about whether they've failed or not, but actually get into more conversations around, what are the things that you're not doing that is inhibiting their ability to be successful. It's a big change in mindset, that, because most procurement folks, and I'm sure be many examples of where I've done that, were more interested in preserving our companies and making sure that we minimize any potential cost increases, regardless of the fact that we may very well have caused some of it.
Yeah, and I think really when you look at that, the variability in a project once it's up and running, and if it's not quite as advertised, this is where the change request, the variation process comes into it. And from our point of view, that's something that people get very excited about. It's just the ability to capture change requests as part of that granular process, because it's a fluid situation. Things change, stuff gets delivered late. The client, the end customer might, for example, make the project late, and therefore it looks like a milestone's late, but it's not the supplier's fault. If you can see that information in real time, then you can react to it to correct issues. But also you might have a consultancy that work on a piece of a project for an organization, and it takes twice as long as they originally predicted. But actually, if you're scoring quantitative metrics and also scoring qualitative information, then you might also know that it took Deloitte twice as long as they predicted, but they did a fantastic job. For example.
I can see that. I mean, it's interesting. One of the best examples I came across in my career was Heathrow Terminal 5.
Right.
So that was basic. I mean, the story goes, as I understand it, it came in on time and in budget, quite unprecedented for construction projects of that size. But what the foundational part of that was that all of the various actors in the process of building T5 was a consortium where there was some gain share at the end of the project based on the collective delivery of the outcomes. And I'm sure it's more complicated than I portray. And I'm sure there's lots of people that deserve the credit for that. But what it always struck me as really sophisticated thinking in a supply chain that, let's face it, most construction supply chains are really adversarial. The quantity surveyor, the constructor, the supplier of the materials, the architect, the owner of the project, are all trying to stick it around each other where things go off piece. Get into that blame game. Well, in that particular project, they were able to exercise something far more sophisticated. So, and I think, it's just a shame there's not more of that, if I'm in truth, because I think it's just a much more productive way to run and operate your business.
Yeah, and everyone's bought into the outcome. That's the thing. And I think when we talk about outcomes and we talk about milestones, it is complex and it requires flexibility. But as long as the interaction is captured, you can still retrospectively understand what's being delivered and whether a good job has been done and whether there's value for money and what that's contributed to the business. So, for example, if in some areas it has to be working under an agile methodology, and you might proxy in sprints for milestones. Now, clearly, you don't know exactly what's going to happen in each sprint until you get to it by the very nature of that methodology. But you're still capturing that process, and you're still measuring that process, rather than, again, that situation where stuff is just very basic details are captured and then nothing else is really captured formally, and the work just carries on. It's very difficult for the business to keep a handle on it. And I think for me, being a business-minded person myself, I'm a big fan of pragmatism.
Yeah.
You know, what are we doing? Where are we going? Does everyone understand what the purpose of this organization is, what our ethics are, and what we're trying to do? Does everyone get that? And is everyone driving towards that effectively? And the more you look at these types of issues, you can see how procurement are a very pragmatic function that can really be centrally strategic to that. Not just in the sense of driving the supply chain, understanding that the business needs to be asking for the right things, but also in driving innovation. And another thing that I think is really interesting is, what about all the information you can get from your suppliers? Because if you look at services suppliers, they're really going behind the curtain, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's like I always remember when I was at university, I used to work in a 5-star hotel in my holidays, and I was like a conference and banqueting steward or working behind the bar or whatever it might be. You get to see behind the scenes when you go and stay in a really nice hotel. You see everything beautifully presented to you and all this lovely experience. You go behind the scenes; it's a bit more gritty. And I think services suppliers get to see behind the scenes. Maybe there's a real area of value there in terms of that feedback for procurement as well.
Yeah, I think it takes people like me and the profession to have a willingness to listen to what suppliers have to say, and then a, a, a willingness and a bravery, shall I say, of actually sharing that with the business, warts and all. And you can imagine it's difficult, if you're using a supplier to deliver a big technology project and some things on the part of the business haven't been done in the way that they were originally articulated. Very difficult to kind of share the supplier's point of view on that with the internal stakeholders. But I think that's where, with courage, that's where procurement really changes the whole raison d'etre of the value that you can bring, because allowing those kind of conversations to be done within the boundaries of kind of good supplier relationship management, I think adds so much value. And look, I mean, the thing that I think we've all learned over the past 12 months is we've all got to learn, haven't we? I'm sure going into March 2020, there were a fair amount of us who were very skeptical about how the hell we'd work on Teams or Zoom. Well, guess what? We've been able to adapt, we've been able to learn. And I think that, that learning for all of us is a continuous stream in all of our careers. And companies, my hypothesis would be companies would be a lot more successful if they just listened a bit more sometimes to what their supply chains had to say.
Yeah, I agree. And do you think, so as you said, that is in some ways, it's a delicate conversation to have. Do you think that the most appropriate place for that conversation to start, where is the most appropriate place? Is it within the C-suite, in the sense that
it is, yeah. It's people like me. I have to build relationships with the CFO, the chief information officer, the chief product officer, the chief technology officer. You've got to build relationships with these people. And you've got to kind of talk about the value that you can bring. You can bring them a view on the supply chain. You can bring them a view on what those vendors bring to the party. You can bring them candid feedback on things that have gone well, things that are done badly. That's where it starts. And I think I've always worked on the basis that as long as the messages that I'm looking to deliver to the C-suite are based on positive outcomes that I want to accomplish, it's about protecting the business, it's about alerting potential risk, then I think there's no reason why that shouldn't happen. I think what happens and what I've seen is that people get very defensive. The feedback or the messaging or the insight is used to hamper people's particular projects or cast a shadow on their credibility or question whether they're any good or not. That, where that gets used, complete failure. And people that do that, frankly, are like a cancer in an organization. I would sponsor the idea that using supplier insights positively strengthens the whole enterprise, and is good.
Yeah, I mean, on an individual level, most people would accept that taking feedback and learning how to improve yourself from feedback is a very valuable, it's very much part of the modern management process within businesses. And this is just looking at that on a bigger scale, in my opinion.
It is. Yeah. Look, again, I think everybody that goes through the annual appraisal process, there's always kind of the feedback thing. And, you either look forward to it or you treat it with a little bit of hostility and skepticism. Supplier feedback is exactly the same. You either use it with positive intent or you kind of treat it with a bit of hostility and, get very combative about it. Quite honestly, the most successful organizations that I've been engaged in and the most successful organizations that I've seen prosper have this kind of growth mindset. And the growth and people think, oh, that growth mindset is about revenue growth and all that kind of stuff. No, it's not. The growth mindset is about, are you receptive to people saying what you've got wrong or right? Are you receptive to learning new things? Are you receptive to taking feedback from a wide surrounding area of interests and things like that? That's what the growth mindset is. And I think people get a little bit stuck on that. They get very defensive on the feedback. And it's like, feedback, well, I would also add, though, feedback has to be delivered well. It's no good saying, Johnny, you did a super job, but here's the one thing you did great. Here's the 10 things you did crap. I mean, quite honestly, frankly, if that's the type of managers that we've got out there, then they shouldn't be managing. But like I said, I think that growth mindset and being receptive to what suppliers have to say marks out, the most successful organizations versus the ones that are frankly just going to flounder.
Yeah, I totally agree, because it's what's it all about, isn't it? Is it about egos? Is it about taking a defensive view on it, or is it about saying, how do we make this business as effective as it can possibly be? And I think when you're talking about feedback being delivered right, I totally agree. I mean, I'm always saying to my daughter, don't just tell me the problem, come up with a solution. And it's kind of that approach is, you could be going to the C-suite as a senior chief procurement officer, and actually saying, okay, right, listen, this is some feedback that we're getting. These are things that we need to be aware of. How can we all work together to maybe improve this? And you might get some people saying, well, the suppliers are wrong, but as a C-suite, surely at that level, the pragmatism can trump egos, and people can really look at it objectively and go, it's all intel, it's all data, it's all information. I think it's very valuable information, and it ties into this whole point of innovation in the supply chain and the value of that. Because there's stuff coming back in, and if suppliers never have a chance to make a suggestion, then you might be missing out on some really good input. And also, when it comes to innovation, I've heard this said before. Someone's posed the thing to me and said it's pretty hard to do for a supplier to deliver innovation when they're in an adversarial relationship.
Oh, absolutely. It's so funny. When I worked for Philips Medical Systems, I mean, she's going back many years. On the one hand, I was told to beat the living hell out of the supplier to get a unit cost reduction. And then I was, at the same time, I said, and by the way, what's the 3 innovations you got for me? Now, at the time, I was too naive to really understand how that is so polar opposite. But I'm sure that a lot of that is still going on today. But this, as you were talking, Johnny, this brings me back to the conversation that we were talking about diversity, because we're building up a team in Kantar, procurement team, and I'm very proud of the leadership team that I've built. And what's really made me very proud about what they stand for is that we are bringing on board and onboarding people new into Kantar to do procurement. We started with 2. We'll have a bigger team than that when we finish. But everybody's coming in with a real kind of growth mindset from very diverse backgrounds, very eager to learn. And I think, you've got to, it's all very well talking about, the growth mindset, being open to feedback and all that kind of stuff. You've got to work very hard on the team dynamics to make that work, and really make sure that you're bringing in a team of folks that are really up for it and able to respond in the way that you'd like them to. And yeah, I'm very pleased to say that I think in Kantar we're accomplishing that.
Fantastic. And I guess the kind of other side to that is the business needs to appreciate that, and actually, but the business are more likely to appreciate it if the procurement team are having this approach that naturally makes them more strategically valuable.
Yeah.
Where they're not just coming in of the mindset of like, this is just a transactional scenario that I will come in and this is how it will operate. It's just about cost reduction. Where they're thinking and they're approaching this in a more holistic manner and a more strategic manner from the get-go. Even people who are maybe quite junior, if they're schooled in that approach and they're told that that's an opportunity and that's open for them to think like that, then I think that can make a huge difference. It must be very exciting for you being in that position to do that.
Well, it is. I mean, it's probably the first time in my career that I've built something from scratch. I was very fortunate because there were some great people in Kantar that I could leverage off, and we've been able to bring some very good people from the external marketplace into the business as well. So got a real melting pot of new experience coming in, and coupled with people that have been in the business for a while, and it's working out really well. But like I said, it's a bit like you've got to build a team that's kind of has the sponge-like qualities of being receptive. Yeah, like I said, I'm very blessed that I've been able to have that opportunity here. Yeah, I've worked in other places where it's very, very difficult. I was involved in a transaction when I left Vodafone. I won't mention the business, but you'll see it in my LinkedIn. And it was really, really difficult, the people have been there 30, 40 years. Changing that mindset was very, very difficult to do. And ultimately it resulted in the sale of that business to somebody else. And I think that was probably a good outcome, because I think changing it with the folks that were there was going to be nigh on impossible.
Yeah, and sometimes there needs to be a clear catalyst for change, doesn't there? And I think in that sort of situation, the acquisition of an organization by another firm, that is a real catalyst for change. It enables that change. But I also think that, outside of all the awful things that have come from COVID, of which there are obviously many, it has been a real catalyst for change. Like you say, for organizations and countries looking at their supply chains, for example. There's other things going on in the kind of global market, certain kind of legislative changes, like, for example, in the UK, the IR35 reforms, where it's looking at employed versus self-employed. That's making some changes to how work gets done. And I think those sort of things are going to have effects. US is likely to follow suit, 1099 versus W2 kind of legislation, similar things in Germany, other places in Europe as well that are looking at it. I think most countries, governments will look at this as saying, is this worker employed or self-employed, and kind of change that dynamic slightly. But when you look at the supply chain on the services side specifically, I think the drivers of COVID and other factors that are shining a light on this area, it enables companies to justify having more engagement with the smaller suppliers as well, where otherwise they can just be overlooked. And I think, again, that's where granularity of data and understanding of your supply chain and what's actually happening is important, because whether it's people changing how they work, so whether somebody was working as an individual contractor and then decides, with the way the market's changing, they actually want to get together with some like-minded people and form a small consultancy, for example, or a small specialist provider, or whether it's just, smaller businesses coming through, offering greater agility or more diversity. That is something that is definitely an opportunity within the long tail. Do you think that's something that gets overlooked?
I mean, I would agree with you that COVID's been, in terms of how we've responded to that, has been really fascinating. I mean, it's given us an insight into people's lives. I can't tell very much from your study, but you can probably tell from the list of my books that I'm a bit of a historian. The Hitler-Stalin book on my left-hand side, I should say, just to be clear, is not a reflection of my leadership style. But you know, for a lot of us, you know, it's given us an insight into a part of our lives that often people would have no idea. You'd have no idea that I have an interest in history, well, a bit of a passion actually. And I see that with my colleagues as well. So I think we've got a much better understanding of our colleagues, I think, in some cases. You know, and even, I mean, I have 4 children, but they're older, but I've got colleagues that have younger children who run in and out. I mean, and I think the positive things are it's helped us remind ourselves that life's more than just work. We've got families and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not a fan of work-life balance because I think it, in truth, for all of us, we're constantly got this thing going off. So I think Jeff Bezos doesn't use that phrase. He just says it's a continuum. You know, sometimes you take a Friday off, sometimes you work a Saturday, all that kind of stuff. It's a kind of yin and a yang going backwards and forwards rather than this idea that it has to be 50-50 because our careers aren't like that. So that's been great. What it's really interesting that I was talking to my boss yesterday because we're thinking about when people come back into the into the workplace. One of the feedback I'm getting about the way you and I are talking is that actually for teams, it's actually made teams a bit more inclusive because we're a very wide geographical business. I have someone in Asia Pac, someone in EMEA, someone in North America, and I have my team in London. You know, historically, what would have happened is we would have been in an office in London. You know, the guys from other parts of the world would have been in on a screen, and by and large, they would have felt as a side to the conversation because they weren't really part of it. Well, now we're all on Teams. It's given a quality to the opportunity for people to express their points of view in a way that, you know, historically wouldn't have been the case. So that's been super, super positive. I think also, you know, frankly, you prioritize where the value is in the things that you want to talk about. So tons of positives there. Having said all of that, of course, I'd never be an advocate of having another global pandemic like that, just to make sure we're a bit more productive and a bit more inclusive in the workforce. Quite the opposite. But I do think there have been some positives, as you say, that have come out of it, no doubt.
Yeah, it just feels to me like it's leveled the playing field a little bit, and you're having more personal interactions. You can see from my light fitting that I'm not massively into DIY, for example. Okay, I've got this set up like some sort of weirdly angular white sort of command center here in my loft room. But yeah, I mean, it brings a personal element to it.
It
you know,
does.
just you're seeing people more in their normal clothes. They haven't got of the big shiny office and you know the big corporate structure around them, and I really like that. I've really enjoyed, just felt like that more personal interactions, and as you say, with getting your team together and allowing everyone to really be involved in a conversation. It doesn't matter where you are, or you know, it's irrelevant. It's just you're part of the conversation.
Yes.
And I think just going back to the point you made about work-life balance, I think that's a really interesting point and a very good point. And I kind of see it as tying back to what we were talking about earlier around purpose. Because ultimately, you're talking about the thing of like, sometimes you might work a Saturday and sometimes you might take a day off, or it might not be quite so hectic, or whatever it might be. You might go and pick the kids up from school. COVID definitely feels like it's made that more acceptable. But if somebody's values and view on the world are aligned with the purpose of the business that they work for, work feels less like work to a certain extent.
Absolutely. I think that's so interesting, you know, and I think that's probably what Bezos is talking about, which is this idea that if you think that you want to split the 7 days of your week into a way which gives you perfect harmony, that's probably missing the point. The fact of the matter is, we're all at different stages of our careers, different stages of parenting, different stages in our family life. The one thing that probably we should all lean into is the work that we're doing. Are we really enjoying it? And like you said, does it give us purpose? And I think if it does, quite honestly, the extra discretionary hours that we put in doesn't feel like that much of a ask. Certainly in my experience, it doesn't, and certainly I'm not finding that at Kantar. Yeah, there are tough days, but do I buy into the purpose of the company and the mission and change that we want to go through? Absolutely, I do. But it's interesting. You talk to lots of people. They hate their jobs, etc., etc. And yeah, I feel sorry for them. And again, I won't be ashamed in saying there's been points in my career where I've found myself in the same place. Actually, my journey into Kantar was off the back of leaving a business that I didn't really enjoy working for. But I would encourage everybody to have a bit of courage, because ultimately it comes good.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see the trends in young people coming into the workplace and how work is structured for them now. The opportunities is so different. Gone are the job for life days of 60 years ago. We transitioned through this massive growth in the contingent workforce, with more flexibility and independence for people. And then you've seen the growth of the gig economy, and this move towards more outcome-driven scenarios, whether it's big service providers delivering on outcomes or whether it's individuals delivering on an outcome basis. And I think it allows people to focus more on what they're interested in and what they're good at, and align purpose, than necessarily just thinking, I need to work for a big company in this sector and do that for 40 years because that's the standard path.
Yeah, I listen. My eldest daughter is 19, and my next daughter is 18. I just think they're entering a world of opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think it changes. For a lot of employers, the relationship is fundamentally going to have to change, because employers have got to think more about what the proposition is to the employee. We're living in a world where the percentage of people coming into the workforce is getting smaller and smaller. So people used to talk about that war on talent. People don't talk about that language so much these days, but actually I do think that's going to get even worse in the coming generations. And it's so interesting. I think people are looking for purpose going into the companies that they are looking to work for. And frankly, if employers can't offer that, then they're just not going to attract the type of people they need to thrive and prosper.
And I guess that competition for talent also extends within different functions.
Yeah.
So if procurement functions can really sell the idea effectively of what good strategic procurement really can be, and the value it can drive, and the what it's like to work in that environment, and to be at the center of those type of interactions, that's something to be considered as well, as is what you mentioned earlier about the competition within the supply chain for talented suppliers.
Yeah. I mean, we're gonna try an apprenticeship scheme this year in Kantar.
All right.
For procurement people, so we're going to bring a couple in. And you could test it, see how it goes. Because one of the things I feel really passionate about is that procurement is a great place to have a career in. But I don't think, coming back to some of the earlier parts of our conversation, that it resonates with people, or it necessarily thinks there's a destination that people can go to. So I'm very optimistic. Stephen Day won't change the world, but maybe for a couple of people, I'll create opportunities for a career that they never thought was necessarily something that they want to go into.
So listen, you've got some really I think very forward-thinking views in this area, and you've got a very clear idea of what a chief procurement officer's role within an organization can be and should be. In terms of kind of the industry moving more towards that viewpoint, firstly, do you think that most CPOs have that viewpoint? And secondly, do you think that chief procurement officers as a kind of community are ready for the challenge and the opportunity that awaits them?
It's a mixed bag. I'm very fortunate. If I think of the people that sponsored me through my career, a guy called Detlef Schultz, that a lot of people will know, somebody called Ninian Wilson. I've had some great sponsors in my career. So I've seen the best of the best. I've also seen a couple of things that I didn't think was very good. So like every profession, Johnny, you know, there's good and there's bad. And at the same time, you know, there's people like you, there's other people that are bringing technologies and solutions to the marketplace that I think that is accelerating kind of pro tech, if I can use that phrase. So I think we're all moving in the right direction. But I do think there's a bit of a call to arms. I think we can do more and we can do it quicker. And I think we can work harder to bring in more folks into it as a destination, as a career, rather than a place that they stumble into. And I think we can do that by really positively promoting how important supply chains are from a diversity and inclusion perspective. Because my going in position is that if we own that and drive it, suddenly, you know, we're expanding what we can contribute to a company beyond just can we save money. I'm very hopeful that, you know, that will really resonate with folks and really begin to make them think about this as a place to come to rather than end up in.
Fantastic, excellent. Well, listen, let's round it off there. I really appreciate your time. Absolutely fascinating insights and great to chat to you about all of this. And actually, I think it's quite an inspiring view on this, and certainly, hopefully, something that resonates with other procurement people. Certainly makes sense to me, and as I say, I find it quite exciting because it's all about the possible, isn't it?
Indeed, it is. Yeah.
But anyway, listen, fascinating to chat to you. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Hopefully, catch up with you again soon.
Yeah. Cheers, Johnny. Thanks for the opportunity.